From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Last week, we had an episode devoted to a very influential 18th century book called The Fable of the Bees by Bernard Mandeville. And we had a very capable guide leading us through that book, Dr. Spencer Leonard, a historian who primarily focuses on South Asian studies. Although I know Dr. Leonard personally from a collective project that we both belong to called the Platypus Affiliated Society that kind of thinks about the problem of freedom in modern society through history. Now, this week, we're going to expand on that conversation. In the first week, we sort of set out the context of why Bernard Mandeville has created this very peculiar beehive and what he's trying to get across. This week, we're going to get into that a little bit more, what Bernard Mandeville saw as the stakes of doing this kind of writing this book and depicting the bees in this way, and its influence through history. And at the end of the episode, we've got this great, as you know, in all shows, we have this where our guest tells us, book recommendations, and favorite tool and favorite pollinator. And Dr. Leonard turns the tables on me at the very end and asks me for my favorite pollinator. And so lots of secrets to be divulged in this week's second part podcast devoted to Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees with Spencer Leonard. Thanks a lot for joining us again this week, Dr. Leonard. And I want to pick up on a theme that was developed in the first episode that we did, namely in this grumbling hive that Bernard Mandeville describes in his poem. In some ways, its actual grumbling is pointing towards recognizing what it is, that there's something about the form of society that comes into being in Bernard Mandeville's lifetime that he's trying to express through these bees. And the one metaphor that I really loved was this idea of this new form of wealth that the society generates, which he kind of analogizes to honey. The honey that's produced the wealth of society as being something quite different from how wealth may be generated in a previous form of society. And that people need to be clear about it. Like, it can't just take any wild direction. There's a way in which for society to advance, the grumbling really needs to settle on these questions. So I want to ask you about that because it seems to me the other theme that came out is that people may not be fully aware in their participation in all the activities that constitute this new form of society of what it is, clearly because they're pieces in the society. So how does he think about this grumbling? Like what should be the stakes of this grumbling, and why he thinks that people need to sort of snap out of this idea of like society is just virtuous people doing virtuous things, why that leads to maybe less clarity of what it is.
Right. So, just to kind of underline the point, this issue of like, on the one hand, I guess you could put it in kind of classical Marxist terms, but really they're terms that go back into the Enlightenment. On the one hand, the bees are free, right? And as it were, individual bees, right? We are free in society. We pursue our own purposes. We develop our own capacities in and through our sale of our labor, our work, the way that we engage in society. And together, and that creates a sociality which is expansive, right? That's changing, that's growing. And one of the ways in which it's growing, or an aspect of that, is wealth, right? We think of wealth as quantitative, but it's not merely quantitative, right? It's actually giving greater scope to the way that we live in society, the new ways of living. So that idea of the individual flourishing, contributing to society's flourishing, which has, as it were, an economic dimension.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Mandeville's getting at, right? That the individual and society are mutually reinforcing. And this is the bourgeois dream, right? This is the Enlightenment dream of a society. In other words, the more complex society is, the more complex as an organism, as a sociality it is, the more the individual flourishes in his individuality. Right. Whereas we often think like the more powerful society gets, the more it crushes us as individuals, the more it, demands obedience, the more it's, stamping out any misinformation that we might be subject to or we might want to assert in society, the more it's forcing us to conform, etc. That's not the way Mandeville's thinking about it. Right. Mandeville's thinking about the hive and the bee as sort of mutually constitutive. And that's the vision that he has for the society of his day. Now, this issue of, it's around that we have to think, right? It's around this question of the relationship of ourselves to society that the bees are grumbling, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're talking to themselves about the way that they live, just as we do, right? Every day, in every newspaper, in every magazine, in every television show, not just in the news, but also in Law and Order and everything else, right? We're reflecting society back to ourselves, right? So he's catching on to that, which is also very modern, right? That a modern society is a self-conscious society, is a self-reflective society, right? And to me, this is the most interesting part of the book. But of course, it's also a tricky part because Mandeville's wicked. His book's condemned. It's even burned at the stake when it's translated into French. And many people, it was tried. It was condemned in England, but it wasn't actually burned in England, by the hangman. But it was in French. And, of course, as everybody pointed out, his name was Mandeville.
Oh dear.
Right. So the wicked part of the poem is that it shows how, in response to a widespread demand for a moral society, as he puts it in the poem, everyone cries, "Damn the cheats." The bees abandon their own commerciality. They abandon their way of life, and as he ironically puts it, honesty fills all their hearts. But with what result? The bees lose their prosperity. Immediately, the prostitutes, the lawyers, the drug dealers, the moneylenders, the sailors and the shipbuilders, the bartenders, the locksmiths, right? He has locksmith bees and sailor bees and moneylender bees, etc. The dealers in luxuries of all sorts, the cops, the quack physicians, the stockbrokers, the lying politicians, the priests, they all lose their jobs. The beehive economy, because of course all of these people, and this is you can see how subversive it is he's basically comparing drug dealers, bartenders, and prostitutes to priests and politicians.
Uh-huh.
Right? Because he's saying, well, they all serve our vices. Right.
Huh.
If you want to, right, if you want to hate other people, right, if you want to like get really mad about, how stupid people are, get hysterical about Donald Trump and all of his idiotic followers, right? Mm-hmm. You can call them deplorables. You can say that they're clinging to their guns and to their religion. The politicians play to your vices. Right. The priests play to your vices. They're there, of course, and Mandeville's making, perhaps an anti-Catholic point, right? Because Protestantism is sort of uncomfortable with the very idea of a priest. The priests are there to let you sin. You can go and have sex with the prostitute, and you can go to the bar and get drunk, and then on Sunday morning or, whenever, you can go and the priest will absolve you of your sin. You give him a couple bucks, drop a few bucks in the offering plate or whatever, and, you'll be fine. In case you die that day, you'll go to heaven. Right. So in all of these ways, Mandeville is saying, look, our society is based on vice. You'd better not get rid of it. Right? Don't say, damn the cheats, because cheating each other is the basis of society. Right? If you're going to go and buy a car, you're not worried about whether or not the car dealer can stay in business if he sells you a car at an extremely low price. You are concerned to get it at the lowest price possible. And of course, he's concerned to make you pay as much as possible. He isn't concerned about, isn't my profit margin a bit high? No, he's out to cheat you. So we can't say, damn the cheats. This is Mandeville's point.
So I
Go ahead.
No, I suppose so. The idea is that, the idea of society being sort of led by the virtuous is getting in the way of recognizing what society is, that it is actually a liability in being able to comprehend things. Why he's taking these strident positions.
Right. And of course, his point is that what you're calling vice isn't vice, actually. Right. Mm-hmm. He's using that rhetorically. If you view this society from a medieval perspective, it looks wicked. It looks like it's based on vices. But actually, what's happening is people are behaving in accordance with the law of a new form of life. Right? That what's important is not the morality of the behavior, but the lawfulness of the behavior. Right? So what happens to the bees that want a moral society who don't understand, in other words, who are operating with an old morality? Their economy collapses, and the few that survive the kind of apocalypse that results end up flying to a hollow tree and living. That is to say, from a point of view of his audience, what his audience would understand. Great Britain, which had been at continuous war with all of the forces of continental absolutism, at the head of which stood Louis XIV's France, would give up its struggle, and in that sense would betray the promise of newly emergent bourgeois society. So the science of society, though Mandeville coyly maintains that it will only do good if the aim is that it will do no good if the aim is that people are to be made better, is actually necessary. The science of society is necessary because it's necessary to clarify the basis of our modern freedom. People who are trying to succeed should not attack others who are trying to do the same thing. That's an immediate goal. to put an end to the notion that society rests on kind of Christian virtue and that the most virtuous, presumably the saints and the knights, namely the Catholic Church and the aristocracy, should rule over it. No. But on a more fundamental level, Mandeville is telling us a story of the self-domestication of mankind in history. As I was saying at the beginning, society passes through epochs in the history of sociability and thus in the history of morality. And it's necessary, at least now it has become necessary in the early 18th century, to achieve a greater self-awareness of this fact, of the fact that we domesticate ourselves and that we have domesticated ourselves to a new type of society, one that thoroughly undermines the old aristocratic prejudices against workmen, against merchants, as well as the old prejudices, the old kind of religious prejudice. So there was the aristocracy's prejudice against merchants and labor, right? People who get their hands dirty. But there's also the priestly prejudice against luxury and ease, which was in part the priest's prejudice against the aristocracy, right? And what Mandeville is saying is that if this society is going to come into its own, it had to understand that while it might be necessary to conduct war, to preserve itself, to expand itself, to protect itself, ultimately what the old morality thinks of as pride or self-liking or self-esteem, he calls it self-liking. It's a precursor to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's notion of amour propre, of a love that is appropriate to ourselves or directed at ourselves. That this has been transmuted as a basis of society into something that goes beyond violence and aggression into peaceful competition. So that commercial society allows everyone, including people who are not well born, including people who have no pedigree, to compete for public esteem and approbation in peaceable participation in civil society.
I was thinking, you brought up earlier the Shakespeare quote where the idea is that you can't discern the difference between pillaging and commerce. Here, even, people will be able to generate the honey of society, this expansion, by just their mutual kind of participation in society.
Right. By getting and spending, by participation in the cash nexus, right? By participating in the marketplace, by arguing with each other, by buying newspapers that disagree with one another, right? With trying to outdo one another, right? Trying to have that BMW instead of just the Chevy that your neighbor has, right? All of those things, right? Mandeville's saying, like, yes, those things are all good, right? Those things are better than jousting. They're better than, ritualized war. They're better than holding peasants in subjection, right? Rather than proving ourselves through violence and self-subjugation, we channel our love of ourselves, our selfishness, into something that is good for society, right? That's the famous subtitle of the poem, How Private Vices Are Public Benefits. Right. This has its, echoes in Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, in Immanuel Kant's notion of unsocial sociability, right? That it's out of our attempt to compete with one another that we're most social. right? That sort of thing. Right?
I love the way that you expressed it. You were mentioning Immanuel Kant, unsocial sociability. It seems like a paradox, but yet.
Right. So these are all Mandevillian thoughts, right? And he's one of those figures who, he's perhaps even more wicked than someone like David Hume. A lot of times with Mandeville, people won't say his name. Later people who are influenced and who are, a lot of times in the 18th century, they don't say who they're being influenced by at all anyway. Okay. Right? They just take it for granted that we all know that these ideas are in the air. Here's my take on them. But people do mention influences from time to time, and certainly Immanuel Kant did. Rousseau does, Smith does. It's rare that you see the hat tipped explicitly to Mandeville, even though when you do, people will say just how influential he was. Adam Smith, Rousseau actually do point it out. It's one big gigantic thought, right? Which is actually a thought that, just as nature, for your scientific audience, nature's actually emerging for the first time as a idea, right? That okay, these animals and this world out there in nature, it's not governed by God or by sprites or by fairies or by any kind of, pagan forces or Christian forces. It's governed by laws, right, that are which is just to say that there's orderliness that we observe, right, and that all of the animals in all of nature they have their own purpose. They're not there for us exactly. And at the same time, we can discover all sorts of uses for them. Mm-hmm. In the same way, society is emerging, and I think society is actually a critical concept to understand nature. Right? To understand that what we are is nature, thinking about nature.
Huh.
Right? We are nature's own developed consciousness. That consciousness is there in the other animals. Other animals, presumably think about their own environment. They're reacting to it. They're contemplating, should I do this? Should I do that? In some sense, they're experiencing fear. They're experiencing joy. They're experiencing excitement. They're experiencing suspense, whatever, right? The cat's watching that mouse, right, in rapt attention. In the same way, we are looking at the world. And one of the things we have to understand, and when we look at it, is there's the world that we make for ourselves. And then, there's what goes on at the top of that Himalayan mountain, which really couldn't care less about us, or what goes on in those distant galaxies, or what goes off amongst these deer when we're not watching them. Right. All of those things, right. There's nature that is, as it were, outside of us, even though we are it. Right. That's the significance of Mandeville thinking about animals that have created a conventional sociality that they keep changing. right? So that we can say, well, there was ancient society and there was medieval society and there's bourgeois society and there's modern capital and capitalist and industrial society. That concept of like nature in humanity that at the same time is subject to, we never cease to be animals, but we're also molding our instincts and molding our passions, channeling them in society. That's what Mandeville contributes.
That is fascinating. I never quite thought of it that way, but there's in becoming conscious of society, and its emergence, that sort of gives people the capacities to reflect on nature as a whole. But I want to punctuate that thought, but I also want to transition. I have a final question for you that I wanted to sort of just put a bow on the legacy, this gigantic thought that sort of is expressed by Mandeville. But as you point out, is sort of Mandeville's also not just thinking these things; he's expressing, he has the concern of the 1688 English Glorious Revolution and wants to make sure that it advances. And I wanted to end with this idea of what you mentioned earlier, that there's a way in which the Fable of the Bees, perhaps unnamed, still resonates into the 18th century. And I recall you had recommended a book to me at one time, and I really enjoyed it, the McPherson book on the Civil War, Battle Cry of Freedom. And in that book, it recalls a debate that happens in the lead up to the American Revolution between Thomas Hutchinson and James Otis on the problem of the colonies. And in this debate, Hutchinson argues that the problem with the colonies, the people of Boston, is that the common people live too well. And Otis, on the other hand, responds that American people cannot be too prosperous. They cannot import too many goods, and that a tariff on luxury goods would undermine the fabric of American society. And McPherson at that point says, this echoes Mandeville. It's just, quite remarkable. And I guess I want to ask, why did Mandeville seem so relevant to revolutionaries of the 18th century? And, does it still resonate today? Or in what ways does this thought resonate today?
Oh, that's a great question. So just to remind your listeners, right, Thomas Hutchinson is an agent of the British Crown. He's the governor of Massachusetts, which is a royal appointment. So when he's debating with James Otis, who is a lawyer, basically, in Boston in the 1760s, Otis is really important in the earliest stage of the American Revolution, which is to say in the early 1760s up to and especially in the Stamp Act debates in 1765. So Mandeville is a creature of an earlier time, right? His concern could be viewed as partially conservative in that he's anxious for the consolidation of the Glorious Revolution in the face of an international threat of absolutism. In other words, which I've talked about a lot, but there was also an internal threat, right? There were people who were loyal to the old royal house, to the House of Stuart, to the House of James II. And those who want to restore that house, who are most prominent in Scotland, but are also to be found throughout England and Wales, are known as Jacobites. That's what the term Jacobite means. It means the restorationists in 18th century Britain, and they have a number of uprisings in the 1710s, I believe, in 1713 and 1719. And kind of the last great attempt is in 1745. So he's concerned that we don't let our discontent with all of the corruption that's made visible in the new regime. For instance, there was a famous commercial sort of racket scheme called the South Sea Bubble, which the state was involved in. There was all sorts of corruption of ministers and so forth. He's saying, look, you can't let that, just because there's corruption, just because this world isn't perfect, we can't go back. We have to defend the order that we have. We have to defend we have bigger fish to fry. We have to worry about the Jacobites. We have to worry about the French absolutists. We're fighting wars on a number of continents. By all means, let's stamp out corruption. But at the same time, let's understand that we need to give scope to this society. We need to have the laws, like the laws that guarantee our personal liberties and our property, et cetera, that generates a lot of wealth, that then there can be some corruption in the redistribution of it that won't make, a fundamental difference. That's sort of the spirit of defending the Glorious Revolution in the 1720s, right? That's why people are reading his book in such large numbers.
Okay.
And why he's read as a Whig. And in people who were alive, American revolutionaries who were alive at that time, say Benjamin Franklin, would have agreed entirely. Right? They would have been like, yes, it's great to be English. We have to defend the ministry, no matter how corrupt Prime Minister Walpole is, no matter how corrupt these ministers are. We have to defend this order, because otherwise they're going to get rid of Parliament altogether. We're going to have an absolutist monarch. We're going to be made slaves. It's, in a bourgeois sense, we're no longer going to be subject to the law that we give ourselves, et cetera. So that's his world. The American revolutionaries are descendants, as the example of Benjamin Franklin implies, of that earlier Whigism. Right? They, of course, defend the legacy of 1688. Right? This revolution of 1688 is the first American Revolution. It makes a big difference in the way things are done over here. And everybody knows it. And everybody's inspired by the thinkers of 1688. So, the great thinker of the revolution was a man named John Locke. John Locke, you didn't sit down to have a discussion with John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, the left of the revolution, the right of the revolution, the proto-federalists, the proto-republicans, the proto-Jeffersonians, the proto-Hamiltonians, none of them. You're not in debate unless you have John Locke, chapter and verse. This is the grammar of politics.
Okay.
Right. And so we're all Whigs, including the British ministry that we're opposing, right? So what's happening, in short, is that it's not, by the time you get to the American Revolution, just saying you're Whig isn't enough, right? You have to clarify it. And so there's a lot of ways in which people talk about it. A very common way of talking about it in the United States, or in the 13 colonies, is that people called themselves patriot Whigs. Right? A lot of times people think American revolutionaries, when they call themselves patriots, are saying that because they really love the nature of America. They love the trees. They're patriots. They love their country, or some crap like that. It's not some blood and soil proto-nationalism. Patriotism means I'm a follower of the Whiggism of William Pitt. That's what it means. William Pitt was a prominent politician in Britain who was viewed as a radical, but he called himself a constitutional Whig. He called himself an original Whig. He called himself a patriot Whig, and the patriots in America are followers of that. This was a person who actually supported the American Revolution from within the Parliament.
All right. So if I get just to sum that all up, so, everybody in the American Revolution would have considered themselves, well, even
Hutchinson.
Even Hutchinson would have understood themselves as a kind of the legacy of 1688 and Mandeville, but clearly there's a divide opening up, and that I don't quite understand.
Right. So here's where Mandeville fits in. The spirit of Mandeville is, look, we made a revolution, but what did we accomplish? This is why I began by talking about the Reformation, the Enlightenment, etc. Did we just keep a Protestant, a Catholic from being the king? Is that the significance? What is the significance? What are we trying to do? Right? What is the project that we're really trying to advance here? Is it a theological project? Are we trying to create a godly society? Are we trying to create a Christian society? What are we trying to do? Right? And so you might call this a scientific Whiggism. Let's get clear. Let's reflect upon the revolution and understand what is at the core. This is what's at the core of the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution is saying, in order, and why do you have to do that, right? Why do you have to be clear? Because actually, you can't preserve we can't preserve the freedom that we have without advancing it.
Huh.
Right? We can't hold on to the legacy of the revolution unless we advance it. This is a very modern thought. Right? This is how defenses of capital, of what in a sense, a layman might call capitalism, what I've called commercial society here. Right? Mandeville is inspiring someone like Adam Smith, and beyond him, someone like Karl Marx, because they're all people who are saying, when you change society, you bring it to a crisis such that it has to change again.
Ah, I see. So
right, it has to, right, and so that's the need for reflection, right? We have to reflect on what we've done, because actually what we've done goes beyond what we originally imagined.
So someone like Hutchinson may kind of go back on this tradition because he's fearful of the change. And it's like, it seems like in his statements.
Absolutely. Okay, he's trying to stabilize it. But by 1776, the British Revolution's in crisis. The American crisis is an expression of a wider British imperial crisis, the British Empire itself being built on revolution, whereby British elites are trying to resolve that crisis by turning the empire into something more exploitative than it had been before. Hutchinson's a tool of that project. He's a tool of this crypto-Tory repressive project that is being expressed in India and in the Americas. The Indians don't really resist it for reasons that I could talk about at great length, but they don't. The East India Company builds an empire in India that helps to prop up a British oligarchy. The Americans resist it. They see what's happening in India, and they say, screw the East India Company, we're dumping their tea in the harbor. right? Because that's emblematic of an empire-wide repressive project. They see Hitchens as a tool, therefore, of an ossified British elite. They brand him as what he disclaims. He says, I'm a Whig. They say, no, you're not. You're a Tory. You're a traitor to the British Revolution. And to them, Hutchinson is the face of a crypto-Tory or rotten Whig, degenerate Whig oligarchy in London. The Stamp Act that Hutchinson's trying to impose would have, it attacks the core of the revolution. It seems so minor, but it's not just that it's taxing commercial transactions, right? It requires that contracts, any printed contract, not necessarily printed, any handwritten contract, any IOU, anything in that, anything that we might call a check, any bill, look, I agree to pay you, in 10 months, the following sum. All of it had to have a stamp. That of course was a tax. So you're taxing commercial transactions themselves. You're taxing our sociality, right? You're taxing the actual social relations in as much as those are formally contractual. And you're also taxing newspapers and magazines. These had to have a stamp affixed as well. So here you're not just talking about taxation without representation, what most Americans think the issue was, right? That the British Parliament is imposing a tax directly on the American colonists, and that tax isn't being, as it were, collected by our own it's not being imposed by our local representatives. It's being imposed by people we didn't vote for. It's not just that. As a radical Whig, Otis is pointing out the Stamp Act is attacking the economic vitality of society, and it's rendering society less capable of grumbling, right, in Mandeville's terms. By taxing newspapers and magazines, it's making society less capable of reflecting on itself. Because, of course, taxing the press is making newspapers and magazines more expensive. It means that common people can't read them because they can't afford them, and therefore they're not catering to a broader market. They're catering to a more elite market, the newspapers and magazines themselves. And so the American Revolution, just to extrapolate from that point, isn't just about rights in some abstract way. It's not just about, my right to think what I want or my right to say what I want. What is the point of those rights? What is the point of the institutional order that's built by the American Revolution, of the Constitution, of the Republic, right? The point is to give scope to the development of society, to give scope to our ability to change. This was what people don't understand when they, for instance, attack misinformation, when they try to limit free speech, when they try to limit our grumbling. Because there never was an idea, a new idea, that was born with majority consent. Mm-hmm. Every new idea emerges as, misinformation, if you will. Mm-hmm. Right? We have free speech in order that we can change the way that we live. ultimately, from a revolutionary perspective, from an 18th century Enlightenment perspective, we have these rights. We have the ability to assemble. We have the ability to publish. We have the ability to associate with whom we please, in order that society can become something that we can't foresee. Right? The American revolutionaries, the 18th century, this is the real difference between us and them. And this is their critique of us. We are now afraid of change, but we can only imagine it as technological. Right? They imagined that humanity would change morally, that it would change in its attitudes, that it would change in its mores, in its habits, in its practices, in a way as to render them entirely obsolete. Their whole purpose was to open the door to a future that would make them absolutely antiquated. Right? Whereas we too often think, well, the world shouldn't really change. Right? Or we just need some technocrats to modulate, how things are taxed and where we distribute the money and what government programs. But the idea that society could completely change, that we could open into a new form of life, that we will seem as strange to the future as the past seems strange to us, is a thought that I think is perhaps less common now, right? Whereas the revolutionary thinkers that are heirs to Mandeville, they're not just talking about asserting ancient virtues. They're not just saying, well, we need to get rid of the kings and aristocrats. They're saying we need to give scope to human advancement in history, right? So that when he says that, and I guess this is the last thing I'll say, and that there's a Mandevillian and an American, an 18th century revolutionary critique of the 18th century ideas themselves, right? That there's a sense in which their thought invites us to go beyond the ways that they imagine freedom to be realizable. To put that more concretely, Mandeville thinks we need ambition and avarice, envy, and fear to, in a sense, motivate our society, right? That what makes us work, what makes us, submit to society is the need to work. That's how we participate in it. And he thinks that maybe he can't imagine it being otherwise. But we live in a time where really that old bourgeois form of life is coming into fundamental crisis in a way that Mandeville could certainly recognize, inasmuch as it suffers from endemic unemployment. Right? That the very idea that the more we work, the more we participate in society, the more that's available to fewer and fewer people, actually. And the more it makes us actually discardable, fungible. Right? It's in that way that our freedom is generating its own problems. Right. And I would argue that in that, in this sense, like the old project of being a busy bee, of being a productive member of society, of everyone being in the hive, right? That is increasingly less available to us. Or we might say that the idea that participating in the hive is mutually beneficial to the bee and to the hive, right? That society and the individual are mutually reinforcing. That may not be true in the same way. And Mandeville would ask us to reflect upon our society and to see how our very freedom is pointing beyond the way that we live. Right? This is how I would suggest that even the defense of capitalism that we see in someone like Mandeville or Adam Smith actually is motivated by a project of freedom that isn't wed to any specific institutional order, right? But imagines at the most fundamental level that the way that people will exercise their freedom in the future goes beyond what we can imagine, and yet we must advance that.
That is fantastic. That is it's interesting to think about how these thoughts, the kernel of the thought, although the world has changed and the specific concerns have changed, may still resonate in the present in a different way. Let's take a quick break. I want to come back. We do a segment at the end of the show. I'm very curious what your answers are going to be, where we ask our guests 3 questions. I've never had a historian on the show, so I'm very interested in your answers. Okay, we are back. So I've got 3 questions for you. The first one is do you have a book recommendation for our listeners?
Well, you mentioned one that I'm just going to repeat. I said briefly, I could say a lot about the conquest of India by the British in the 18th century. That's because professionally, I'm a South Asian historian. That's my field. And even when I've gone for job interviews to be a South Asian historian, to be hired as a South Asian historian, and someone asks me, what's your favorite history book? I'll still say James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom. I've said that for so long, I don't know if I still believe it. I've read a lot of great history books, but it's a masterpiece. There's no doubt about that. And it gets at the crisis of the American Revolution, I think very much in the spirit of the way that we've been talking today. The way in which, for instance, it deals much more seriously than we're accustomed to now in our rather lobotomized context. Our very limited public discussions today deals very seriously with, for instance, the slavery question. Right, with the relationship of the American Revolution to slavery. Why, of course, the American Revolution was opposed to slavery. That, of course, they expected this institution to die out. They set it in train of ultimate extinction, to use Abraham Lincoln's phrase, and yet it comes back, and it comes back in a dynamic, expansive, and threatening way under the impulse of the Industrial Revolution and the production of cotton. I would also, if I can sneak in a second one, I would say that my friend James Vaughan's book on the politics of empire at the accession of George III is, I think, really one of the most important books on the American Revolution, but really the American Revolution in world history, in British imperial history, but ultimately in world history, to come out in a very, very long time. And I think it would help to understand a lot of the stakes in terms of what I was saying with respect to the legacy of 1688. So those would be my two historians' book recommendations: James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom and James Vaughan's The Politics of Empire and the Accession of George III.
And we'll have both of those linked in the show notes. And what I think they're, kind of remarkable is in some ways they kind of bookend the American Revolution in a really great way. And the, James Vaughan's book really taking up the, this, Mandeville forward kind of world.
Right. Exactly.
Fantastic. Okay. Excellent. Next question I have for you as a historian, if you have a go-to tool, a sort of indispensable tool that you rely on or you use a lot.
Well, the thing that I've been using a lot recently is, in some ways it's old, but now it seems to be everywhere, which is voice recognition software. It's everywhere. I use it a lot in Google Docs. You realize how, and I think I see it actually in my devices, in my Facebook feed. I think my phone understands what I'm saying better than it used to. Mm-hmm. I think that the surveillance state, which is obviously, not really like people listening, so much as computers listening, has gotten a lot better. But, to turn the tools of the master against him, in other words, voice recognition wasn't really built for me. It was built to oppress me, but I nevertheless use it a lot in my writing. I use it in taking notes. I find it's really advanced very far beyond what it was when I tried and failed to use it as a graduate student writing.
It's really gotten to the point. Last phone I had, it could transcribe on the fly. I would get, just the computing power, because I remember the old transcribing programs, they just couldn't do it, and you were always going back and backspacing. To some extent, you still have to do that, but they are getting remarkable. And I love the idea. I imagine as a historian, you'll be reading something and a thought will come to you, and you want to express it quickly so that you don't lose the thought. And this must just speed the process up.
It does, and I find I like to write drafts of what I'm writing, just by saying it out loud.
Well, fantastic. Despite its perhaps nefarious origins.
Indeed.
All right. Our last, my last question for you, and this, as a historian, I'm not sure if this comes across your purview, but we ask all our guests if they have a favorite pollinator species, and I'm curious if you might have one.
I think my wife probably has one. I think she might even know what a pollinator is. I think she might know. I think it's a plant, but I don't know if it's a plant or the thing that pollinates the plant. I just don't know what a pollinator is, Adoni. I'm hopelessly ignorant. But
I think this is in the spirit of Mandeville's, a Dutch frankness.
Yeah, I know about these things. I know my wife likes flowering plants, and I know that if I buy them for her, she stays happy for a day or so with me. And that's, of course, highly to be desired, cultivated. Right? That's all that I know. What is your favorite pollinator species?
It's funny. Nobody's asked me that question, but it is clearly the honeybee. And it is for the reasons of, raising this in this episode. I loved honeybees because there was a whole kind of truck and trade around them. You could go to any city and people would be keeping bees. You go to, a small little coffee shop in North Dakota, and there would be somebody whose business was, and I loved that honeybees, unlike any of the other pollinators, really had this big network of people. And that's, primarily my love of honeybees is the people behind the honeybees.
I never knew whether I was supposed to be afraid of the bees or not. I still don't. I feel like I'm practicing some kind of Zen, like mind over body or something, when there's a bee and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to move. I'm not going to be fussed by this thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's rational or not. It is some kind of, there is some irrationality in my response to bees. And I don't think I've ever approached a beehive. I've never done any kind of beekeeping.
Well, the next time you and I are together.
Do the bees sting because they're confused? Do they do it? In other words, do they sting us on purpose or are they sorry?
This is a question that's never been posed to me.
Clearly, you don't talk to many children because my questions are about as sophisticated as a child's.
I do a lot of education with children, and the one thing I point out, there's about 2,000 species of bees in the United States, and many of them are not social. They don't have a society. They are just like a bird. They make a nest and they provision it. The vast majority of them are like that. They're not very defensive. And the analogy I say, or the point I say, if you took one of them and put them in your nostril and squeezed it, they may sting you. But, apart from that, but most people don't even recognize them. It requires a high level of specialization to recognize this little thing the size of a 12-point comma is a bee. Yeah.
Right.
So, Do
beehive bees, has human cultivation made them more sociable?
No, it's a remarkable.
Or did that occur in nature and we just sort of make benefit of that?
It's a strange thing because it's a small industry, the beekeeping, and so and also the breeding of bees is very difficult because they mate in the air. You can't pen them like cattle. So they're very undomesticated. They actually leave the hive in the same way Mandeville's, when the society collapses. It does happen and the bees just kind of disperse, but they leave domestication all the time and go live in the woods. It's a funny little system.
See, we can't do that, Adoni. If our society collapses, it isn't going to be just like a peaceful return to the woods. It isn't going to be just like Genghis Khan comes and lays waste and we just sort of rebuild and the cycle resumes. It's going to be uglier than that.
The stakes are much higher for advancing Mandeville's project. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time, and
of course.
I'm excited to hear how listeners, some of the themes. This is a very different show than we've ever done before, so I'm excited for our listeners to hear it.
So glad. Thanks, Adoni, for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.